My name is Rachel Bell, and at 34 years old, I am a captain in the United States Air Force. But at my father's 4th of July barbecue, that meant nothing. In front of his old Army buddies, he brushed my hand away when I tried to offer a charity check and sneered, "This is my daughter, Rachel, a real keyboard warrior down at Fort Meade." Then he threw his arm around a Navy SEAL and declared him the real deal. And then came the moment, the one that froze my entire life. He looked right at me and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, his voice dripping with contempt, "The Taliban wouldn't even blink at you, Rachel. But this," he slapped the SEAL on the back, "this is a real soldier." My father didn't know that the hero he was fawning over had just gone completely still. He wasn't looking at my father. He was staring at me, at a tiny scar on my temple, and he whispered, "Wait a minute. I know that scar." Let me know where you're watching from in the comments, and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever had your own family turn your accomplishments into a punchline. The performance began the moment I pulled my Honda into the driveway of my childhood home in Fairfax, Virginia. It was a perfect portrait of American patriotism, meticulously staged. The air was thick with the smoky perfume of burgers and hot dogs sizzling on a top-of-the-line Weber grill. Small American flags, planted with military precision, dotted the perfectly manicured lawn. From a Bluetooth speaker tucked away on the porch, the strains of the national anthem gave way to a playlist of country music hits celebrating trucks, beer, and freedom. It was all so perfect, so wholesome. And it was all a lie. At the center of it all, holding court on the back deck, was my father, retired Army Colonel Robert Bell. He wore his crisp, navy blue Army polo shirt like a suit of armor, the eagle emblem gleaming over his heart. He was in his element, a pint of Sam Adams in one hand, gesturing grandly with the other as he entertained a circle of his old Army friends. As I got closer, I could hear him spinning one of his favorite yarns, a story about coordinating truck logistics in Germany that, through his telling, had somehow morphed into a strategic triumph on par with the Battle of the Bulge. My mother, Helen, emerged from the sliding glass door, balancing a large bowl of her homemade potato salad. She moved through the crowd with a practiced, serene smile, the perfect hostess, the dutiful wife. She spotted me lingering at the edge of the deck, and her smile tightened just a fraction. She glided over, her voice a low, urgent whisper in my ear. "Try to get along, dear," she murmured, the same four-word warning she'd given me at every family gathering for the last 20 years. It wasn't a request for peace, it was a command for my silence. I nodded, feeling the familiar weight settle in my chest. I was an actress in a long-running play, handed a script at birth that I was sick to death of performing. I decided to get the obligatory offering out of the way. I'd brought a check for $200 made out to Vets for Vets, a charity my father championed. It was my attempt at an olive branch, a way to participate in his world on his terms. I navigated through the clusters of laughing guests and approached my father's circle, waiting for a pause in his dramatic retelling. "Dad," I said quietly, holding out the envelope. "I have this for the fund." He didn't even look at me. His eyes were fixed on his audience. "Just put it in the jar over there," he said, waving a dismissive hand toward a large pickle jar on the serving table already stuffed with cash and checks. Then, without missing a beat, he turned to a portly man in a VFW cap and chuckled, his voice carrying easily over the music. "My daughter," he announced, as if presenting a strange specimen. "She thinks $200 can buy respect." A few of the men around him snickered. The sound was like a physical blow. The air rushed out of my lungs, and for a second, the sunny backyard went blurry. I felt a hot flush of shame creep up my neck. I looked down at the check in my hand, my own signature on it, and it suddenly felt cheap. Foolish. My gesture of goodwill had been twisted into a pathetic attempt to buy his approval. This wasn't the first time something like this had happened, not by a long shot. But it still hurt like it was. Just then, my father spotted the man he'd been waiting for, Lieutenant Commander Wolf Jackson, the Navy SEAL. Wolf was a legend, a man who moved with a quiet, coiled power that made my father's blustering seem theatrical, and hollow. He was leaning against the railing, talking to someone, a bottle of Budweiser held loosely in his hand. "Wolf, get over here," my father boomed, striding over and clapping him on the shoulder. He practically dragged Wolf into the center of the circle, presenting him like a trophy. "Gentlemen, now this is a real hero." I tried to melt into the background, but my father wasn't finished with me. He gestured toward me with his beer. "You see, my Rachel here works at a desk at Fort Meade, pushes buttons, a keyboard warrior." The familiar contempt laced his words. "But Wolf," he said, his voice swelling with borrowed pride, "Wolf is the real deal. He's been in the sandbox, kicking in doors." And then came the final, killing blow. He looked from Wolf's powerful frame back to my service blues, which suddenly felt like a costume. He looked straight into my eyes, a cruel glint in his. "The Taliban wouldn't even blink at you, Rachel," he said loud and clear for everyone to hear. "But this—" He slapped Wolf's broad back again, hard. "This is a real soldier." I saw my mother standing nearby, close enough to have heard every single word. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second. I saw a flicker of something, discomfort, maybe pity, before she broke contact. She turned away, suddenly engrossed in straightening a stack of paper plates on the table, her back a rigid wall of denial. As if by ignoring the words, she could erase them. Her silent complicity, her deliberate choice to abandon me in that moment, was a deeper, sharper wound than my father's public scorn. A suffocating silence fell over the group. The men shifted uncomfortably. But in the middle of it all, Wolf Jackson wasn't smiling. He hadn't joined in the backslapping. Instead, he took a small, almost imperceptible step back from my father. His relaxed, off-duty posture vanished, replaced in an instant by the focused tension of a soldier on high alert, a man who'd just recognized a threat, or an ally. His eyes, sharp and piercing, scanned my face. They weren't looking at me with pity or amusement. They were analytical, assessing. And then, they stopped. They locked onto a spot just above my right eye, on a faint silvery line on my temple, a scar so old I usually forgot it was even there. A look of dawning, impossible recognition crossed his face. The casual backyard barbecue faded away, and for a second I could see the battlefield in his eyes. He let out a breath, his voice barely a whisper, but it cut through the silence like a gunshot. "Wait a minute," he said, his gaze fixed on the scar. "I know that scar." It wasn't a question. It was a declaration. A puzzle piece slamming into place with a force that seemed to shake the very foundations of my father's perfectly staged party. A shiver ran down my spine, a cold dread mixed with a bewildering spark of something else. My carefully constructed world of silent endurance had just been cracked wide open. What does he know? Wolf Jackson's words hung in the humid Virginia air, an impossible question mark at the end of a humiliating day. "I know that scar." "How?" My mind raced, trying to connect a Navy SEAL I'd never met to a faint line on my temple from a childhood fall. But his question wasn't a key to a new mystery. It was the key to an old, locked room filled with ghosts. And as I stood there frozen in my parents' backyard, the door to that room creaked open, and the memories flooded out, cold and gray. It started with the Sunday dinners. Every week, the same suffocating ritual. We'd sit around the mahogany dining table, the air thick with the scent of my mother's roast beef and my father's disappointment. After his second glass of bourbon on the rocks, the sermon would begin. My father, an only child, had never learned to share the spotlight, and his dinner table was his stage. "Strategy isn't about some damn computer," he'd declare, his gaze sliding pointedly toward me. He'd gesture with his fork for emphasis. "It's about moving a division across Europe under fire, logistics, manpower. That's the real army." My mother would nod along dutifully, a placid smile fixed on her face as she passed the mashed potatoes. "That's right, Robert." My younger brother, Mark, who'd wisely chosen a career in business, became an expert at deflection. The moment my father's attention shifted to me, Mark would quickly bring up sports, asking about the Washington football team's chances that season, anything to steer the conversation into safer waters. I learned to eat fast, my eyes on my plate, shoveling in food so I could politely excuse myself and escape to my room. Upstairs, surrounded by books on cryptography and real military strategy, I could finally breathe. The worst memory, the one that still stings with a fresh, sharp pain, was the day I graduated from my Signals Intelligence Officer training. It wasn't just a graduation, I was the distinguished graduate. I had finished at the top of my class, outperforming some of the brightest men the Air Force had to offer. My chest swelled with a pride that felt pure and hard-won. I called home from a payphone on base, my heart hammering with excitement, ready to share the news. My father picked up. The television was blaring in the background, another Washington game. "Hey Dad, it's me. I just wanted to tell you I graduated today," I said, my voice buzzing. And I was the distinguished honor grad. There was a pause. I heard the roar of the crowd on TV. "That's great, honey," he said, his tone distracted, absent. "Those little computer things you do. That's cute." Cute. The word landed like a punch to the gut, instantly deflating all my joy, reducing my months of grueling intellectual work into a child's hobby. It was a verbal pat on the head. I mumbled a goodbye and hung up, the receiver suddenly heavy and cold in my hand. Later that evening, my mother called back. Her voice was a conspiratorial whisper, as if she were sharing a secret instead of twisting a knife. "Rachel, you know your father," she began. The familiar preamble to 1,000 excuses. He wants you in a job he can understand. Something he can brag about to his friends. Like an army nurse, maybe. Something a little more feminine." The implication was clear. I wasn't the problem, but my ambition was. My success was the issue. I was supposed to shrink myself, to contort my dreams into a shape they could find palatable. But the foundation of their disregard had been laid years earlier, cemented by a sacrifice they refused to even acknowledge. When I was 18, I achieved the dream I'd worked for my entire high school career, a full-ride scholarship to the United States Air Force Academy. It was my ticket out, my future laid out before me in glorious blue and silver. But just as I was preparing to accept, my brother Mark's latest business venture, some half-baked t-shirt company, went belly up. A family meeting was called. It wasn't a discussion, it was a verdict. They sat me down in the living room, my father pacing in front of the fireplace, my mother wringing her hands on the sofa. They suggested that it would be better for the family if I attended a public state university nearby. It would save on costs, they said, and I could stay closer to home. "Family has to prioritize, Rachel," my father said, his voice laced with false gravitas. "Mark needs our help right now." In the end, a significant portion of what would have been my college fund was diverted to bail out my brother. He never said thank you. He just took the money as if it were his birthright. I gave up my dream for them, for a brother who saw me as an inconvenience, and for parents who didn't even register the magnitude of what they had asked me to forfeit. It wasn't a sacrifice in their eyes, it was simply my duty. And now, standing in the fading afternoon light of that awful barbecue, the phrase "keyboard warrior" echoed in my head, a bitter reminder of their willful ignorance. My desk job was a windowless, climate-controlled SCF, a sensitive compartmented information facility, buried deep underground at Fort Meade. The only smell was the sterile hum of server racks and the burnt aroma of stale coffee brewed around the clock. I didn't push paper, I was Angel. I was the unseen voice, the steady hand guiding Reaper drones as they sliced through the skies over Afghanistan. My voice was a lifeline, a harbinger. The difference between life and death for soldiers on the ground. I remember the night I saved Wolf Jackson's team, Odin 3. The surge of adrenaline as I analyzed the infrared feed, seeing the heat signatures of an ambush forming in a blind canyon, a detail the ground intel had missed. The gut-wrenching tension as I made the call to override a direct order and divert them, my voice calm and authoritative in their headsets, even as my heart hammered against my ribs. And then, the profound, dizzying relief when General Hale's voice crackled over the line, confirming my read was correct, that I had saved them from being wiped out. I lived and breathed in a world of stakes so high my father couldn't possibly comprehend it. His world was black and white, defined by parades and polished brass. Mine was a world of shadows and signals, of life and death decisions made in milliseconds, 7,000 miles away from the fight. And because he couldn't understand it, he belittled it. His ignorance had curdled into contempt. That day in the SIF, after Odin 3 was safely back at base, I had looked at the grainy screen showing the empty canyon where they would have died. And I made a silent promise to myself. I promised that I would never let their small-mindedness define my worth. That my work, my sacrifice, was real, whether they ever saw it or not. You know, it's one thing to be misunderstood by the world, but it's a whole different kind of pain when the people who are supposed to know you best refuse to see you at all. If you've ever had a dream or an accomplishment dismissed by your own family, hit that like button. And in the comments, just type a simple, "I see you." Let's show each other the support we didn't get. I had held onto that promise for years, a secret source of strength in the quiet dark. But standing there, with the man I'd saved staring at the scar that was part of my story, I realized a promise wasn't enough anymore. It was time for the truth. Time seemed to warp in the space between Wolf Jackson's whispered words and my father's next breath. The cheerful country music faded into a dull throb. The scent of charcoal and grilled meat turned acrid in my throat. In that stretched-out moment, something inside me shifted. The years of accumulated pain, the endless compromises, the quiet swallowing of insults. They didn't explode. They crystallized. I didn't run. I didn't cry. A strange glacial clarity washed over me, chilling the hot shame in my veins. My training took over, not the basic training of a cadet, but the advanced analytical training of an intelligence officer. I looked at my father, and for the first time, I didn't see the towering figure who held the power to validate or destroy me. I saw a target. I saw a man whose bluster was a flimsy cover for his own deep-seated insecurities. A man desperately clinging to a borrowed glory he'd never earned himself. His entire identity was built on the fiction of being a real soldier. A fiction propped up by belittling the real service of his own daughter. Then my gaze shifted to Wolf Jackson. He was a warrior, that much was obvious, but right now he looked rattled, like a man trying to solve a complex equation in his head while the world spun around him. He was grappling with an impossible truth, his mind racing to connect a scar in a suburban backyard to a voice on a radio half a world away. And in that instant, I knew. The silent promise I had made to myself in the darkness of the SCIF was no longer enough. My silence wasn't strength, it was complicity. It was the fuel that had allowed this toxic fire to burn for 34 years. My silence ended today. My father, oblivious to the tectonic shift happening inside me, saw only what he wanted to see, his daughter, standing quiet and still. He misinterpreted my shock as submission, a return to the familiar script. He saw his chance to reassert control, to dismiss the awkward moment Wolf had created. "Well, all right then," he said with a condescending pat on Wolf's arm. He turned to me, his voice returning to its default tone of command. "Rachel, go get Lieutenant Commander Jackson another beer. He must be thirsty." It was the last order he would ever give me. All my life, I had obeyed. I had deferred, conceded, and retreated. But the woman standing on that deck was not the little girl who ate her dinner in silence. I turned my head slowly, deliberately, until my eyes locked with his. The clamor of the party, the friends, the hero seal, it all dissolved. There was only him and me. And for the first time in my life, I said the word. No. It came out quiet, calm, and unshakable. Not angry, not tearful. It was a simple statement of fact, a boundary line drawn in granite. "No, Dad," I repeated, my voice steady. "I don't think I'll do that." The look of stunned disbelief that washed over his face was more satisfying than a decade's worth of arguments could ever have been. His jaw went slack, his face flushed a blotchy red. He had no protocol for this. Disobedience was not in the family playbook. But I wasn't going to engage him in a shouting match. That was his battlefield, his area of expertise. Mine was information. I wasn't going to launch a frontal assault. I was going to execute a precision strike. I took a deliberate step back, widening my field of view. I was gathering intel. I saw Wolf, still processing, his eyes darting between me and the scar he somehow recognized. I saw my father's friends, their jovial expressions replaced by looks of confusion, a flicker of curiosity, even doubt. The narrative my father had so carefully crafted was beginning to fray at the edges. I didn't need to scream to tear it apart. I just needed to provide the right data points. Before my father could recover and launch into a tirade, I moved. I walked calmly toward Wolf Jackson, closing the distance between us. I stopped beside him, turning my back slightly to my father, a clear signal that he was no longer part of this conversation. My voice was low but carried with the clarity of a radio transmission, just loud enough for the men in the immediate circle to hear. "Lieutenant Commander," I began, my tone professional and respectful. "I believe my father has a slight misunderstanding about my role in the United States military. This wasn't a family squabble anymore. This was a tactical briefing." My father sputtered behind me. "Rachel, what in God's name do you think you're doing?" I ignored him. My focus was singular. I looked directly at Wolf, my eyes holding his. This was the moment of deployment. "My name is Captain Rachel Bell," I said, each word a carefully placed munition. "70th ISR Wing." I saw it then. A flicker of recognition, a spark deep in his eyes. The 70th Intelligence, Surveillance, and Reconnaissance Wing. My unit. He knew it. The pieces were starting to connect in his mind, but he was still missing the final, critical coordinate. I didn't need to say more. He would figure it out. But I wasn't going to let him. I was going to deliver the payload myself. The silence had gone on long enough. I leaned in just a fraction, my voice dropping but losing none of its intensity. I was laying the charge, preparing for detonation. "We've worked together before, Lieutenant Commander," I said, letting the words hang in the air for a moment. "Even though you've never seen my face." The confusion on his face morphed into dawning, staggering comprehension. He knew. I wasn't little Rachel anymore. I wasn't the keyboard warrior. I was Angel. And I was about to land right in the middle of my father's barbecue. The silence that followed my words was absolute. My father's face, which had been red with anger, was now just confused. But my target wasn't my father. It was Wolf. I held his gaze, my own expression unreadable, my voice flat and devoid of emotion, like a pilot reading a checklist. This was my after-action report. "Kandahar Province," I began, the first coordinate. "3 months ago, Operation Night Strike." My father started to step forward, his authority reflex kicking in. "Rachel, for God's sake, stop this nonsense." Before he could finish, Wolf's hand shot up. A quick, sharp gesture that wasn't a request, but a command. It silenced my father instantly. The desert tan on Wolf's face had drained away, leaving a pale, ashen mask. He knew those names. They weren't just words. They were ghosts that haunted his sleep. "You are call sign Odin 3, I continued, my voice a scalpel, precise and cold, cutting through the layers of deception. "You were 20 seconds from walking into a 3-sided ambush in the Arghandab River Valley." Wolf's mouth opened, but only a choked sound came out. He swallowed hard. That's classified. How could you possibly—" This was it, the final payload. "Because I am Angel," I stated, letting the name drop into the silence like a 500-pound bomb. "I was the voice in your ear that ordered you to pull back." I paused, letting the truth detonate. I saw the moment of impact in his eyes. The shock, the disbelief, the staggering realization. "I was the one who saw that scar on your temple through an infrared camera feed," I added, confirming the targeting data. "From a shrapnel wound you'd taken 2 days prior. I used it to confirm your identity right before I called in the airstrike that covered your team's retreat." The mission was complete. The target was verified. There was no room left for doubt. A deafening quiet descended on the backyard. It wasn't an awkward pause. It was a vacuum, sucking all the air and sound out of the world. The only noise was the sudden, sharp crash of glass on stone. The Budweiser bottle slipped from Wolf Jackson's numb fingers, shattering on the flagstone patio. And then, the legendary Navy SEAL, the real hero, did something that destroyed the last pillar of my father's fabricated world. He straightened his shoulders, pulled his arms to his sides, and snapped to attention. It wasn't a combat stance. It was the reflexive posture of a soldier acknowledging a superior officer, a sign of absolute, instinctual respect. Angel. His voice was a raw, broken whisper. The name was a prayer on his lips. My God, you're the angel of death. That's what we called you. He shook his head, a look of awe on his face. We thought you were a myth, a legend. A legend? My father had called me a keyboard warrior. His hero had just called me a legend. The irony was so thick, so bitter, and so sweet that I could taste it. My father, desperate to salvage his crumbling authority, tried to regain control. His voice was weak, pleading. But she's just Rachel. Wolf spun around, and for the first time, I saw true, unadulterated fury in his eyes. It was the look of a man who had faced down death, and it wasn't directed at an enemy combatant. It was directed at my father. Sir, Colonel, he said, his voice low and dangerous. Shut up. Those two words were more devastating than any bomb. They vaporized my father's power, his credibility, his entire persona. He physically recoiled, his face a mask of utter humiliation. He was no longer the commander of this backyard. He was a disgraced subordinate. Wolf turned back to me for a moment, his expression softening with a respect that felt more real than any validation I had ever sought from my family. Then he turned to address the stunned circle of onlookers, his voice ringing out across the now silent yard, clear and strong. This woman, he announced, his hand gesturing toward me, saved my life and the lives of 6 other men. We were walking into a kill box, and she pulled us out. He wasn't finished. He took a step closer to my father, who looked small and pathetic. She didn't just stop an ambush, Wolf continued, his voice rising with passion. 2 hours later, one of my privates, a kid on his first tour, had his radio go down. He was separated from the squad, stumbling in the dark toward an IED pressure plate. We couldn't reach him. Wolf looked back at me. She could. She got on his secondary comms, which were barely working. And with nothing but her voice, calm and steady, she talked that terrified kid, step by step, around that mine and back to us. He let that sink in, his eyes scanning the faces of my father's friends, who now looked at me with a mixture of shock and awe. Finally, his gaze landed on my father, and it was utterly unforgiving. Your legacy, Colonel, Wolf said, his voice dripping with ice, is shuffling supply trucks in Germany. Her legacy is the American soldiers who came home alive to their families. He paused and delivered the final, fatal blow. She is more of a soldier in her damn chair than you ever were in your whole career. The aftermath of the explosion wasn't fiery and loud. It was a slow, suffocating implosion. After Wolf delivered his final verdict, the party didn't end. It simply disintegrated. My father's friends, the men who had been laughing at his jokes minutes before, suddenly found urgent reasons to leave. They offered mumbled goodbyes, their eyes carefully avoiding my father's, who stood frozen by the grill like a statue memorializing his own defeat. A few of them, the ones who had seen real combat and understood the weight of Wolf's testimony, made a point to walk past me on their way out. They didn't say much. A firm handshake from one. A quiet, "God bless you, Captain," from another. One older man, a Vietnam vet, just met my eyes and gave a single, respectful nod. It was a silent acknowledgement, a shared understanding that transcended words. Wolf Jackson was the last to leave. The fury had faded from his eyes, replaced by a quiet intensity. He walked over to me, bypassing my parents completely. My apologies, Captain, he said, his voice low. I was told your promotion to major was already approved. I must have looked confused. He just smiled faintly. Word travels fast when Angel is involved. I owe you my life. If you need anything, anything at all, this is my number. He pressed a simple, black and white business card into my hand. It felt solid, real. A lifeline. I finally got in my car and drove away, not looking back. In my rearview mirror, I could see them. My mother and father, standing motionless amidst the wreckage of their perfect 4th of July party. They looked small and isolated, the architects of a fallen empire of lies. I felt a strange sense of detachment, of exhaustion. The adrenaline had worn off, leaving only a hollow ache. I drove aimlessly, eventually finding myself on the George Washington Memorial Parkway, heading north along the Potomac River. The evening sun cast a golden glow on the water, the monuments of D.C. rising peacefully in the distance. It was a picture of American serenity, a stark, painful contrast to the war that had just been waged in my family's backyard. I rolled down the windows, letting the warm air wash over me, hoping it could somehow cleanse the lingering stain of humiliation. That's when my phone rang, its cheerful ringtone a jarring intrusion. The screen lit up with my mother's name. My stomach tightened into a cold knot. I knew this call wasn't coming from a place of concern or apology. It was a counter-offensive. I took a breath, tapped the screen, and put the phone on speaker. There was no greeting. No, hello, no, are you okay? Just the hiss of her anger. How could you do that to your father? Her voice was acidic, stripping the paint off my fragile sense of victory. You turned him into a laughingstock in front of all his friends. You ruined everything. Even though I had anticipated the attack, her words still felt like a punch to the gut. All the air left my body in a whoosh. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles turning white. Mom, I said, my voice dangerously calm. I just told the truth. A sharp, humorless laugh crackled through the speaker. The truth? The truth is that you were selfish, Rachel. You always have been. You couldn't just let your father have his one day, could you? You had to make it all about you. It was a masterclass in gaslighting. In her version of reality, my father's years of verbal abuse were irrelevant. My public humiliation was a footnote. The only crime that had been committed was my act of self-defense. My truth was reframed as a selfish grab for attention. The assault continued, her voice rising in pitch, laced with the false tears of a seasoned manipulator. Your father has sacrificed so much for this country, for this family. He worked his whole life to provide for you and Mark. And this is how you repay him? By tearing him down in front of a decorated hero, just so you could show off about your little computer job? Every word was a carefully crafted barb, designed to rewrite history. Their cruelty became his sacrifice. My career became a little computer job. My moment of truth became a childish showing off. And in that moment, listening to the calculated venom in her voice, I finally saw her clearly. My mother wasn't just a passive bystander who chose silence out of weakness. She was the chief architect of my emotional prison. She was the warden who had always made sure the bars were in place, the one who taught me that my silence was the price of peace. Her peace, never mine. She wasn't just complicit, she was the enabler-in-chief. A deep, cold resolve settled over me. The voice of Angel, the one I used to guide soldiers through chaos, took over. It was a voice free of emotion, stripped down to pure, tactical clarity. I took a steadying breath. Mom, I said, my voice cutting through her tirade. I'm not going to argue with you about this. What happened today was the direct result of years of how Dad has treated me. I will not apologize for telling the truth. I let the silence hang there for a beat, a silence of my own making. I need some space, I continued, each word a brick in a new wall. Please don't call me again. And then I did something I had never done in my entire 34 years of life. I ended the call. I reached over and pressed the red icon on the screen, cutting her off mid-sentence. The silence that filled my car was absolute, shocking. It felt terrifying, and it felt, for the first time, like freedom. I had just severed a toxic lifeline, a connection that had been poisoning me one drop at a time for as long as I could remember. I kept driving, the lights of Washington, D.C. getting brighter ahead, and I didn't look back. The days following the barbecue were quiet. The silence from my parents was a heavy, suffocating blanket. After hanging up on my mother, I had braced myself for another assault. A barrage of angry texts, a surprise visit, but nothing came. It was an unsettling peace, the kind of stillness that precedes a storm. I spent my time working, trying to lose myself in the familiar rhythms of data streams and satellite feeds, but a part of my mind was always waiting for the other shoe to drop. Then, on a Wednesday afternoon, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. My heart leaped into my throat, assuming it was my father, finding a new way to breach my defenses. But the message wasn't from him. "Captain, it's Wolf Jackson. My team and I owe you dinner. Friday night, Old Ebbitt Grill, 19 Derzieren Orns. Non-negotiable." I read the text 3 times. The Old Ebbitt Grill, a historic D.C. institution, a place of dark wood, brass railings, and hushed important conversations just a stone's throw from the White House. The directness of the message, non-negotiable, was so different from the manipulative invitations of my family. It wasn't a request layered with guilt. It was a simple, declarative statement of respect. A part of me, the part that had been conditioned for 34 years to avoid confrontation and stay small, wanted to decline. To make an excuse. To retreat back into the safety of my quiet apartment. But another part of me, the voice of Angel, knew this was a command I needed to follow. This wasn't a social call. It was a debriefing of the soul. I texted back a simple, military-style reply. "Copy that, Lieutenant Commander." On Friday night, I stood outside the restaurant, smoothing down my simple black dress, feeling a nervous flutter in my stomach. The place was bustling, filled with the energy of Washington insiders, politicians, lobbyists, journalists. I pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped into the low, warm light of the main dining room. I saw Wolf immediately, seated at a large round table in the back, and he wasn't alone. 6 other men were with him, all of them built with the solid, imposing frames of career operators. As I approached, Wolf saw me and immediately stood up. In perfect unison, the other 6 men rose to their feet as well. The conversations at nearby tables faltered as people turned to look. There was no awkwardness in their gesture, no hesitation. Just a profound, silent show of respect that spoke volumes. I felt a blush creep up my neck, but this time, it wasn't from shame. It was from something that felt dangerously like pride. The dinner was unlike any I'd ever experienced. There was no mention of the disastrous barbecue, no talk of my father or family. It was as if that entire painful episode existed in another universe. Instead, they wanted to talk about Angel. They didn't ask me about classified details or mission specifics. They told me what my voice had meant to them. They passed around stories like sharing plates of food, each man adding a piece to a legend I never knew I was a part of. They talked about how Angel's calm, steady presence in their ears during a firefight was like a shield against the chaos. A young, wiry SEAL with Rico on his name tag leaned forward, his eyes earnest. "Ma'am," he said, "we never knew who you were. We didn't know if you were a man or a woman, old or young. It didn't matter. All we knew is that when Angel was on the comms, we were going home." Hearing my work described not as pushing buttons, but as a promise of homecoming, it was overwhelming. I felt a lump form in my throat, a painful, bittersweet ache. This was the validation I'd spent a lifetime craving from my family, and here it was, being offered freely and generously by a table of strangers who had become brothers. Wolf, who had been listening quietly, finally spoke up, filling in the details of that night in Kandahar. "When you called the audible," he said, looking me straight in the eye, "I was pissed. My SEAL ego was bruised, you know? I thought I had the better read on the ground." He took a long sip of his beer. "But there was something in your voice, an absolute certainty that cut through the noise. You weren't just reading data off a screen, Captain. You were feeling the battlefield." He raised his glass, the amber liquid catching the light. "To Angel," he said, his voice resonating with sincerity. "Who taught an old SEAL that sometimes the best eyes on the target are 7,000 miles away? All 7 men raised their glasses. To Angel, they echoed, the sound a low, powerful chorus. As I clinked my glass against theirs, I thought of my father calling my work cute. For the first time, I didn't feel the sting of his words. I felt only a distant, sad pity for him. His world was so small. My achievements weren't cute, they were legendary. When the dinner was over and we were standing on the sidewalk in the cool night air, Wolf walked me aside. Rachel, he said, using my first name for the first time. We're not the only ones. There are dozens of other teams with Angel stories. General Hale has already put you in for an early promotion to major. It's long overdue. You earned it. That night, as I drove back to my quiet apartment in Arlington, the feeling of loneliness that had been my constant companion was gone. The silence in my car was no longer empty. It was peaceful. I realized I had just had dinner with my real family. A family forged not by blood, but by fire and trust. A family that didn't need me to be smaller, or quieter, or more feminine. They saw me for exactly who I was, and to them, that was more than enough. It's amazing how a little bit of genuine appreciation from the right people can heal wounds that have been open for years. It reminds you that you're not asking for too much. You are just asking the wrong people. If you believe that the family you choose can be more powerful than the family you were born into, hit that like button. And in the comments, tell me one word that describes what family truly means to you. Let's build a dictionary of what real support looks like. For a month, there was peace. A real, profound peace I hadn't realized was possible. The silence from my parents was no longer a weapon against me. It was a gift. I spent a weekend hiking in Shenandoah with a friend, and I started having regular phone calls with Wolf, who was quickly becoming something more than just a man I'd saved. He was becoming a friend. For the first time, I felt like the captain of my own life, charting my own course. On my desk, next to my monitor, sat a framed picture not of my parents, but of Odin 3, a goofy selfie they'd sent me from their base. It was a daily reminder of my chosen family, of what real respect felt like. And then, one Tuesday evening, the peace was shattered by the sharp, insistent chime of my doorbell. My heart sank. I wasn't expecting anyone. I crept to the peephole, and my blood ran cold. My parents. They stood on my welcome mat, unannounced, their expressions grim and determined. They looked like they were here to conduct an inspection. Before I could decide whether to even open the door, my father spoke, his voice carrying clearly through the wood. Rachel, open up, we need to talk. It wasn't a request, it was an order. Reluctantly, I turned the deadbolt. My father pushed past me into the entryway without waiting for an invitation, his eyes scanning my small apartment with a critical air. My mother followed, holding a Pyrex dish covered in aluminum foil. A tuna casserole, her signature peace offering. A bribe. We brought dinner, she said with a tight, forced smile. I didn't move. I've already eaten. The 3 of us stood in an awkward, charged silence in my living room. They sat on my couch. I remained standing, a conscious choice to not get comfortable, to not fall back into old patterns. My mother placed the casserole on my coffee table like a sacred offering. My father cleared his throat, getting straight to the point. No apology, no acknowledgement of the nuclear bomb that had gone off at the barbecue. Just business. It's about Mark, he began. Of course it was. His business is in trouble again. He paused, waiting for me to show the appropriate level of concern. I said nothing. He needs a loan to cover payroll, my father continued, his voice taking on a tone of weary importance. A significant one. But the bank turned him down, his credit history. It's not good. I stared at him, a sense of surreal disbelief washing over me. After everything that had happened, the public humiliation, the revelation, the complete and utter demolition of his authority. They had driven all the way here, uninvited, not to apologize, not to try and understand, but to ask for something. To ask me to risk my own financial future, a future I had built entirely on my own, for the golden boy who had been handed everything and squandered it all. My father finally laid the request on the table. We want you to co-sign the loan. I think I actually laughed. A short, sharp, humorless sound. You can't be serious. This is not a laughing matter, Rachel, he snapped, his temper flaring. No, it's not, I agreed, my voice hardening. You're asking me to put my name, my credit, my entire financial security on the line for Mark's failed business. Again. He's your brother, my mother chimed in, her voice pleading. He needs you. I looked at her, at the woman who had watched me be torn apart and had done nothing. I'm sorry, I said, my voice polite but firm. I can't do that. And that's when my father played his trump card, the ultimate weapon of emotional blackmail. He leaned forward, his face a mask of theatrical sorrow, his voice dropping to a pained, shaky whisper. Before your grandfather died, he said, his eyes welling up with crocodile tears. He made me promise him. He made me promise I would always look out for Mark. He paused for dramatic effect. He said Mark was the weaker one, the one who would need more help. My mother, on cue, sniffled beside him, dabbing at a perfectly dry eye with her knuckle. My father looked at me, his voice trembling with manufactured grief. Are you asking me to break a deathbed promise to my own father, Rachel? Is that the kind of daughter you are? And there it was. The final, desperate, pathetic gambit. An attack on my compassion, my sense of duty, my love for the grandfather I had adored. But as I looked at them, at this perfectly rehearsed performance of manipulation, I didn't feel guilt. I felt nothing but a cold, liberating rage. I glanced over at my desk, at the smiling faces of Odin 3. They had trusted me with their lives. My parents wouldn't trust me to pick a restaurant for dinner, but they would trust me to clean up their messes. I owed it to those men, and I owed it to myself, to live a life free of this poison. That was the final drop. The dam of a lifetime's worth of resentment, of being silenced, of being second best, finally broke. Enough, I said. The word was quiet, but it sliced through the room, stopping them cold. I felt a lifetime of suppressed anger surge through me, not as a hot, messy explosion, but as a focused, ice-cold beam of energy. I am done, I said, my voice as hard and flat as steel. I have spent my entire life stepping back for Mark, stepping back for you. I gave up the Air Force Academy so he could have my college fund. I have stayed silent every single time you've belittled me, dismissed me, and treated me like I was less than him. I stood up straight, my posture no longer defensive, but commanding. I will not co-sign the loan. I will not give him a single dime. And this conversation is over. I walked to my front door and opened it, letting the cool night air rush in. This is my home, I said, my voice never rising, but carrying the full weight of my final, irrevocable decision. And I'm asking you to leave. It was the last declaration of independence I would ever need to make. My parents left in a state of stunned silence. My mother looked horrified, my father utterly defeated. He didn't even look at me as he walked out the door. I closed it behind them, and the click of the deadbolt echoed in the sudden, ringing quiet of my apartment. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel triumphant. I just felt empty. Utterly and profoundly exhausted, as if I had just completed a years-long mission. My legs felt weak, and I slid down the back of the door until I was sitting on the floor. And for the first time in weeks, I cried. But these weren't the hot, angry tears of humiliation from the barbecue. They weren't tears of frustration from my mother's phone call. These were tears of grief. A deep, quiet, sorrowful mourning. I wasn't crying because of what they had just done. I was crying for what was now permanently lost. I cried for the little girl who used to follow her father around the yard, desperate for a single word of praise. I cried for the young woman who had given up her dreams, hoping that sacrifice would finally earn her a place in her family's heart. I cried for the family I should have had, the one of unconditional love and mutual support that I saw in movies and at my friends' homes, a family that I now knew with absolute certainty I would never have. I was mourning a death, the death of a hope I hadn't even realized I was still clinging to. A few weeks passed. The silence from my family was absolute, but this time it felt different. It wasn't a punishment, it was a boundary. I started sleeping better. I found myself smiling more at work. I felt lighter. One afternoon, I was scrolling through my work emails and stopped at one from General Hale. It was the official notice that his recommendation for my promotion to major had been approved by the board. I read it over and over, a quiet, solid warmth spreading through my chest. This was real. This was earned. Then a letter arrived. It was in a plain white envelope, addressed to me in my father's unmistakable, sharp, angular handwriting. For a moment, my heart seized with an old, familiar reflex. For so many years, an apology from him was the one thing I had craved more than anything. It was the key that I thought would unlock my happiness. Now, as I held the letter, it just felt like a piece of paper. I sat down at my kitchen table and opened it. The letter was long, several pages filled with his justifications and self-pitying excuses for his behavior over the years. It was all about how hard his career had been, how much pressure he was under, how he just didn't understand my world. It was a monument to his own ego. I almost threw it away. But then, at the very end, the tone shifted. "I spoke with General Hale," he wrote. "He called me. He told me everything, Rachel. About Odin 3, about Angel. He told me things that, as a colonel, I barely had the clearance to hear. I have been a fool," the letter continued, the handwriting becoming slightly less steady. "I was so busy trying to look like a soldier that I failed to see the real one living in my own house. I am so proud of you, and I am so sorry." I read that last paragraph twice. Then I put the letter down on the table. I waited for a reaction, a surge of anger, a rush of triumphant satisfaction, a warm glow of reconciliation. Nothing. I felt absolutely nothing. The words I had once been desperate to hear now had no power over me. They were like a key arriving in the mail for a house I no longer lived in. The apology was for him, not for me. It was a bid for his own absolution. It had simply come too late. The wound had long since closed over. It had become a scar. And that scar was now a part of me, a reminder of my own strength and resilience. In that quiet moment, I realized that the validation I had spent my life seeking from him no longer mattered. I had already found it. I'd found it in the respectful eyes of Odin 3. I'd found it in the email from General Hale. And most importantly, I had finally found it within myself. My worth was not a reflection in his eyes. It was a fire I had kindled on my own. I picked up the letter, folded it neatly, and walked into my bedroom. I opened a small wooden box on my dresser, a box where I kept old photos and mementos. I placed the letter inside and closed the lid. For me, forgiveness wasn't about pretending the past didn't happen. It wasn't about wiping the slate clean and going back to the way things were. Forgiveness was about acknowledging the truth of what had happened and then choosing to set down the burden of my anger. It was about choosing to walk forward without that weight on my back anymore. I never replied to the letter. My silence this time wasn't the silence of a scared, submissive daughter. It was the quiet, confident silence of a boundary. My silence said, "I hear you. I accept your apology for your own peace of mind. But I will not be returning to that cycle of pain. I wish you well from a safe distance." I had made my choice. I had chosen my new family, the one built on the bedrock of respect and shared experience. The door to my old family, the one I was born into, had finally been closed. Not slammed in a fit of rage, but clicked shut, gently and firmly, locking a painful past where it belonged, behind me. With the door to my past firmly closed, the door to my future swung wide open. The silence from my parents continued, but it was no longer a void. It was an open space, a clearing that was quickly being filled with warmth, laughter, and a kind of fierce loyalty I'd only ever read about in books. In late May, as the city began to swelter under the early summer heat, Wolf invited me to join Odin 3 for Memorial Day. My mind immediately flashed to the 4th of July barbecue, and a knot of anxiety tightened in my stomach. But this was different. There would be no grilling, no beer, no performative patriotism. The invitation was for a private observance at Arlington National Cemetery. That morning, dressed in my service uniform, I stood with them among the endless, silent rows of white headstones. The air was still and reverent, broken only by the distant, mournful notes of taps. There were 7 of them, all in their dress uniforms, their usual boisterous energy replaced by a solemn dignity. We walked to a section where 2 of their teammates were buried, men who hadn't made it home from a mission years before I was their angel. As they placed flowers on the graves, I saw 2 families standing nearby, the parents and widows of the fallen men. Wolf walked over to them, and I saw him speak quietly, gesturing toward me. The 2 older women, their faces etched with a grief that never fades, walked over to me. "This is Major Bell," Wolf said, using my newly minted rank. "She's the guardian angel who brought the rest of us home that night." Before I could say a word, the mothers enveloped me in hugs, their bodies frail, but their grips surprisingly strong. They smelled of old perfume and sorrow. "Thank you," one of them whispered into my hair, her voice thick with tears. "Thank you for saving our other boys." Standing there, surrounded by the quiet dignity of true sacrifice, holding the hands of women who understood its cost, I felt a sense of belonging so profound it made my chest ache. This was honoring service. This was family. The strength of that new family was tested a few weeks later. I was walking to my car in the parking lot at Fort Meade when a familiar figure stepped out from behind a pillar, blocking my path. It was my brother, Mark. He looked terrible, disheveled, his eyes puffy and desperate. He started with pleading, his voice whining about how I had abandoned the family, how his latest business was about to collapse because of me. When I didn't respond, his tone turned nasty. "You know, this is all your fault," he spat, his voice rising. "You and your little drama queen moment at the barbecue. You tore this family apart because Dad didn't pat you on the head enough." I was about to tell him to get lost when a familiar rumble filled the parking garage. A black Ford F-150 pulled up silently behind Mark. The driver's side door opened, and Wolf unfolded himself from the truck. He didn't say a word to Mark. He didn't even look at him with anger. He simply walked over and stood between us, a silent, immovable wall of muscle and quiet authority. He was a foot taller than Mark and twice as wide. "Everything okay, Major?" Wolf asked me, his eyes never leaving my brother's face. Mark's bluster evaporated instantly under that steady, predatory gaze. He visibly shrank, taking a stumbling step backward. We were just talking," he stammered. Wolf didn't respond. He just stood there. Mark took another step back, then turned and practically fled, his footsteps echoing in the concrete structure. Wolf watched him go, then turned to me, his expression softening. He didn't ask what it was about. He didn't press for details or gossip. He just saw a threat to someone in his circle, and he neutralized it. "Come on," he said, gesturing with his head toward the truck. "Let's get some lunch. My treat." It was unconditional protection. No questions asked, no judgment given. Just a simple, powerful statement. "I have your back." Slowly, I became a fixture in their lives, an honorary member of Odin 3. I was invited to their weekend cookouts, real ones, filled with easy laughter and terrible dad jokes. We'd pile onto a couch to watch football games, the air filled with shouting and the smell of cheap beer and pizza. I was brought into their circle of inside jokes, a language of shared experience that I was finally learning to speak. They teased me, but it was a different kind of teasing than I was used to. It wasn't designed to diminish me, it was a sign of affection, of acceptance. They'd rib me for drinking my coffee black, like a real Marine, or for being able to identify an approaching aircraft by the sound of its engines alone. They didn't see my intelligence as cute or threatening. They saw it as a superpower, and they loved me for it. I didn't have to hide any part of myself. My professional life was blossoming too. My relationship with General Hale deepened from one of command to one of mentorship. He saw a potential in me that my own father had been blind to his entire life. During one of our one-on-one meetings, he leaned back in his leather chair, his eyes thoughtful. "Rachel," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "You have a rare strategic mind. Don't you ever let anyone tell you that you have a desk job. The pilots, the SEALs, they are the tip of the spear. But you, Major, you are the one who sharpens it, aims it, and tells it where to strike. You are shaping the future of warfare. He leaned forward, his gaze intense. Own it. His words landed with the force of a revelation. It was the permission I never knew I needed, the ultimate validation from a man so respected that even my father spoke his name with reverence. I was finally being seen, not just for what I did, but for who I was. And I was beginning to understand that I was far more powerful than I had ever been allowed to believe. 1 year later. The setting is no longer a cramped, windowless SCIF buried under the earth. It's a vast, state-of-the-art briefing room at the headquarters of SOCOM, Special Operations Command, at MacDill Air Force Base in Tampa, Florida. Sunlight streams through the floor-to-ceiling windows, glinting off the calm waters of Tampa Bay. At the head of a massive polished conference table stands Major Rachel Bell, me. In my crisp blue service dress uniform, I command the room not with volume, but with a quiet, unshakable confidence. Behind me, a massive screen displays complex maps, data streams, and threat assessments. My voice, the voice of Angel, fills the room. But I'm no longer just guiding a single SEAL team through a dark valley. I am briefing the highest levels of command, shaping the strategic direction of special operations for an entire theater of war. I was once dismissed for having a desk job. Now, I didn't just have a seat at the table, I had built the table myself, and I was sitting at the head of it. In the front row, listening with rapt attention, sits my family. Not the one I was born into, but the one I had earned. General Hale is there, his presence a quiet endorsement of his protégé. And next to him, Lieutenant Commander Wolf Jackson and the entire boisterous crew of Odin 3. They had flown down from Virginia on their own dime, just to be here for my first major briefing as a field-grade officer. I can see it in their eyes, not just respect, but a fierce, familial pride that warms me from the inside out. When the briefing concludes and the applause dies down, Wolf is the first one to reach me, weaving through the crowd of colonels and generals. He shakes my hand, his grin wide and genuine. That was impressive, Major, he says, his voice filled with sincere admiration. Your old man should have been here to see this. I smile, a calm, genuine smile that reaches my eyes. I think of my father, not with anger or bitterness anymore, but with a kind of distant pity. I think of the empty legacy he was so desperate to build. No, I reply softly, my gaze sweeping across the faces of Wolf and the rest of Odin 3. Everyone who needed to be here is here. As the room begins to clear, a young female captain approaches me hesitantly. She's sharp, her uniform impeccable, but I can see a familiar flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. Major Bell, she begins, her voice a little shaky. That was an incredible briefing. I just wanted to say I've always admired Angel's work. You're the reason I chose this career field. I look at this young officer, and I see myself. I see the same ambition, the same talent, and the same quiet fear of not being good enough, of not being seen. I remember the years I spent craving a mentor, a guide, someone to tell me I was on the right path. I place a gentle hand on her shoulder, and her back straightens slightly. Thank you, Captain, I say, my voice warm. Our work isn't loud, but it saves lives. Don't ever let anyone tell you otherwise. I reach into my pocket and pull out one of my own business cards. If you ever need anything, advice, an ear, anything at all, that's my email. Don't hesitate to use it. She takes the card as if it were a medal, her eyes shining with gratitude. Thank you, ma'am. I will. As she walks away, I realize I've just accepted the torch that General Hale passed to me. The legacy wasn't just about my own success. It was about ensuring the women coming up behind me would have the support I never did. Later that afternoon, I'm back in my new office, the sun low in the sky, painting the bay in hues of orange and gold. It's a corner office, a world away from the underground bunker where my story as Angel began. On my polished desk, next to a stack of classified documents, sits a single, silver picture frame. The photo inside isn't of my parents at a holiday gathering. It's a picture taken a few months ago, a selfie with Odin 3 after a grueling joint training exercise. We're all covered in mud, exhausted, and grinning from ear to ear. Wolf has me in a friendly headlock, and I'm laughing so hard my eyes are squeezed shut. I look at that photo, and I understand what a legacy truly is. It's not a name engraved on a medal or a late-arriving apology in a letter. It's not about the approval of people who are incapable of giving it. A legacy is the unwavering trust in the eyes of the soldiers you protect. It's the spark of inspiration you ignite in the next generation. It's the quiet peace in your own soul, the profound contentment that comes from knowing you have defined your own worth on your own terms. My work continues, quietly, shaping events from the shadows. And that, I realize as I watch the sun dip below the horizon, is my inheritance. My quiet, powerful, and hard-won legacy. Thank you for listening to my journey. My legacy wasn't defined by the family I was born into, but by the one I built and the life I chose to create. Remember, your own legacy is not written by those who misunderstand you, but by every single choice you make to honor your own worth and own your truth. This channel is dedicated to sharing stories of strength and resilience. If my journey resonated with you, please show your support by hitting the like button and subscribing to become part of our community. And finally, go down to the comments below and declare it for yourself. Just type, "My legacy is mine," because it truly is. Thank you for listening.